What happens when you take some of the most advanced and impressive arcades of the age, the ones that everybody coos over, the big attractions on the rather sticky amusement floor, and port them over to the microcomputer that lots of people own, but is usually regarded as one of the weakest that you can get? Well, that's the subject of this video here. We're looking at ports of Sega arcade games over to the ZX Spectrum. As it turns out, there's quite a lot of them, nearly 40 games in fact. Naturally, the best thing to do is to try and look at every single one of them, as they span a pretty good range. Of course, you've got some of the best Speccy arcade ports here, along with some of the worst, but you've also got some pretty damn ambitious titles split between a few big-name software houses, and they span from the computer's heyday right through to its last commercial days. Going through this set of games is actually quite a different way of moving through the Spectrum's historical periods, and so the best thing to do is to go through these arcade ports chronologically. We start in 1985, and we finish in 1992. Naturally, this selection is limited to official ports only, as we'd be here all day if we went through games that were inspired by Sega Arcades, and we're going to see a few big names doing the ports. There's one in particular that's going to very much be the standout, and it might not necessarily be a name you readily associate with the machine. Anyway, here we go. The first bunch of official Sega ports to make it to the Spectrum, and indeed to any of the big micros, came from US Gold, who proudly announced a bunch of big arcade ports to the 48K Spectrum in 1985. The boys from Birmingham are going to be a constant in this video. They released the first Sega arcade port to the Speccy, and they also released the very last one. But here we begin with their pretty average version of Zaxxon. It's not exactly the fastest of games, moving along in a rather jerky way indeed, and while Zaxxon isn't exactly a spry game to begin with, it's still a pretty slow affair. All that said, the name itself made this a hit, even if the port wasn't all that hot. It's not awful, but it could really do with a bit more speed and some decent sound, for this game has almost no beeper noise at all. As it goes, it's probably better than any of the various clones of Zaxxon that were around at the same time. Really though, you probably had to wait until the 128K days to get a really decent Zaxxon-esque game on the Speccy. Costa Panay's HATE from 1989 being my personal favourite. We've had Sega's groundbreaking isometric shooter, and now we have their groundbreaking tunnel shooter. Yes, it's Buck Rogers on the Spectrum. And you know what, for being a 48K Speccy game from 1985, this one's not bad at all. It got a pretty harsh treatment from the magazines, who were, at this stage, a little iffy about playing these rather old arcades on their computers. But if you like the 1982 arcade original, this isn't all that bad a version of one of Sega's better early arcades. It's pretty easy on the whole, and there are some similar contemporary games that do honestly give this one a pasting, Death Star Interceptor in particular, but it's a lot more fun than the port of Zaxxon. Up next, we've got Spy Hunter. Hang on a minute, Spy Hunter? I'm sure you're all confused, seeing as Spy Hunter is a Bally Midway game and everything. Well, the case of both this game and the next one is kind of convoluted, but yes, US Gold got the rights to two Bally Midway games through Sega. It looks like they got them through Sega of Japan, who had the license for the arcade game in the East, weirdly enough. It's all a bit strange, but that's why Sega are credited on this and the next game, which is Tapper. Regardless of the confusion, this for me is the first absolutely categorically really bloody good Sega arcade port. Even if there's no Peter Gunn music here, it's a fast, smooth and action-packed version of the arcade that I've been playing for a very long time now. The first one to get some nice scores from the magazines too, a smash both critically and commercially. The port itself comes from the exceptional coders at Denton Designs, so perhaps the quality shouldn't be too surprising. Although no individual member of Denton is credited here, which makes me wonder who was responsible for the port. Ian Weatherburn perhaps? John Gibson? Anyway, it's a fantastic little version of the game, all the driving and boating action you want, and lots of motorcycles to send hurtling off the road. Lovely stuff. The Speccy version of Tapper is also pretty good, for the most part anyway. The arcade's frenetic gameplay carries across well. You still have the careful counting on the fly, the slight hold of the button to pull a proper pint, and all the speed you could want. They haven't really screwed around with anything that makes this arcade bloody brilliant. All that said, the presentation might put some people off. There are the graphics, which are quite messy and flickery indeed, especially when lots of customers are on the screen. Still, this is better for gameplay than having nice clean graphics and virtually no patrons. The thing that's really bad here? Well, that's the music. Just have a listen. This is definitely one of the prime examples of the 48K beeper sounding like a dog chewing a wasp, and it means that you're probably going to want to play this game on mute. But the gameplay is definitely there, even if the game lacks quality in these areas. This US Gold Quartet would also be released in compilation form, coming out as the Sega Collection, even though half of the games aren't exactly Sega. It should be noted that Jeff Brown's boys did release a couple of other Sega ports on other platforms. Versions of Congo Bongo and Up and Down were published for the Commodore 64, but while both games had versions announced for the ZX Spectrum, they were never actually released. It should also be noted that the ZX Spectrum never actually received an official version of Frogger, while the C64 did, thanks to Sierra. Poor Speccy users, shafted again, hey? Ah well, it's not like there weren't literally hundreds of unofficial versions of Frogger to play through. While the first 4 games are all ports of Golden Age titles that were a couple of years old by the time they arrived, our next one offers something much more contemporary. Yes, it's Space Harrier on the ZX Spectrum. You know, Space Harrier, the legendary beyond words superscalar title that wowed arcades like almost nothing else back in the day. How on earth is this possibly going to come over to the ZX Spectrum, in a 48K version to boot? Surely this is going to be bloody awful, isn't it? And the answer to that question is, actually no it's not. Not at all. Elite Systems Space Harrier is shockingly very good. While all the sprites have undergone some very significant shrinkage, the most important thing about the game has been retained. This is very fast, and it's just about full screen too. It may not be a pretty game as such, but there's clearly a great effort to keep the play as intact as possible, and against all odds, it works. Perhaps the slight power edge of the Speccy's processor has a bit to do with it. It's certainly leagues ahead of Elite's C64 Space Harrier, which is utterly dreadful. So a big well done to Elite, and a big well done to Keith, who, as the game constantly tells you, was the programmer of the port. This Keith, by the way, is called Keith Burkhill, and this is not the first time you're going to be hearing that name. And here's another high-quality port. Enduro Racer from 1987 is the first port here to very much be a 1-8K sort of game. You can play this in 48K, but the 1-8K version has the excellent use of AY sound that really does beef up this port. While the graphics are all a bit monochrome, and you should kinda get used to this, we've got some fine speed here, and tracks that are appropriately busy. The monochrome nature is important to note, I suppose, especially as the 1-8K era of the Speccy kicked in. It seemed like a lot of software houses settled on crisp and clear monochrome graphics as a way to finally do away with the computer's infamous colour clash, which was seen more and more as a total no-no on the system as the years went by. Not that we won't be seeing a few rather colourful games as we soldier through these ports, but monochrome is definitely going to be the order of the day. And besides all of that, this is an excellent arcade port for the system. What's also notable about Enduro Racer is that it's the first appearance of Activision in this video. Of course, this is not really the mega company Activision of today. This is the one that was owned by Mediagenic and were, in these times, more associated with computers than consoles. Activision had a sizable presence on the spectrum, both under their own name and with their UK-based developer brand Electric Dreams, and they're responsible for a lot of these Speccy ports. Activision made 14 of these Sega Arcade ports, second only to US Gold 16. And really, Activision do have more if you discount the 3 US Gold ones that aren't really Sega games. This isn't the only high quality one we'll be seeing by them either. Quartet got a port to the Speccy thanks to Activision, and it's okay. A pretty obscure one. It should be noted that despite the appearance, this Quartet can only be played by 2 players at a time, so hey ho. The game doesn't transition too badly to the Speccy, but the graphics can get a little bit messy from time to time. Now, in all honesty, I'm not the biggest fan of Quartet, so I find it hard to muster up too much enthusiasm for this version of the game, but those who do enjoy it might be interested. There's also a more modern hack to this game that throws some cool 128K AY music into the mix, so you may want to seek that one out instead. Another one from Activision, here's the Speccy version of Wonder Boy. The simple little side-scrolling platformer that was hardly indicative of what the series would become, Wonder Boy is presented here in Speccy monochrome and it's really annoying. I don't know what it is about this version, but I find it to be incredibly hard. Seriously, the jumping is such a pain in the arse whenever you have to do too much of it, and annoyingly you don't get any bloody continues at all. In all my time playing it, I've never gotten past the first area. At least the horizontal scrolling isn't too bad, and it is at least better than the other Wonder Boy that we're going to see later. US Gold are back again, and, well, here's one of their more infamous arcade ports. A big subject of controversy back in the day, and a port that's seemingly almost designed to make the Speccy look thoroughly weak and miserable. Yes, it's OutRun. As you can kind of see, this is an utter dog of a port. There are times when it feels like it's barely moving, especially on the stage with the stone archers. There's other times when the game can't seem to actually render the friggin' road, and there's a lot of times when the road feels almost totally empty and devoid of anyone except you. The miserable experience that was US Gold OutRun was hardly limited to the Speccy. It was a complete duffer on almost every other platform, from the fellow 8-bit Amstrad to the 16-bit Amiga and Atari ST. But the Speccy version was the subject of some controversy due to screenshots on the cover and in the magazines that most definitely appeared to be doctored a bit, with the in-game screens looking a lot more action-packed and sprites looking a great deal bigger. People didn't think that these were representative of the game, and one wonders if they were from some earlier version. Another annoying thing is that, actually, the folks at Probe Software who made this were also behind the pretty damn good port of Enduro Racer we saw a few games ago, which makes you wonder what the bloody hell went wrong here. This is one of the most famous Sega Arcade ports to the Speccy, and indeed to any microcomputer, and it is absolutely one of the worst. At least the AY versions of Magical Sound Shower and Splash Wave are okay, I guess. Thankfully, we do have a much better attempt at a racing game to show off immediately, washing away that terrible OutRun stain. Super Hanon, coming courtesy of Activision via Electric Dreams, is a total winner here on the Spectrum, just as it was on most other micro platforms, and is one of the best examples of a micro port getting it right. Once again, even if the graphics aren't quite there, if you were to do something as silly as comparing it directly to the arcade anyway, what's here is excellent for the system. And the gameplay is pretty much here. Lots of bikers to weave around, lots of speed, and of course, a big old turbo button. The Speccy version of Hanon isn't quite on the level of the brilliant Amiga version, but it's not far off at all. The only thing that it's really missing is a decent AY music option. Top marks for this one. Here's a little factoid. The music that is here, on the Core Select screen, was made by Turkish coder Mev Dink, and it's, not good. Ah well, this Mev Dink is the same person who'd go on to set up the Vivid Image studio and create the awesome First and Second Samurai, among many other great games, so he definitely made up for it. Okay, here's another odd one. Desolator, originally, is another game that's not a Sega arcade game, nor does it have that name. The original arcade here is known as Kiros, or Halls of Kiros, and it's a 1986 game by Alpha Denchi where you punch and kick zombies from a top-down perspective, and it's all a bit tongue-in-cheek. Apparently this game was an inspiration for Zombies Ate My Neighbours. Why is it here? Well, because Sega had the license to publish the arcade game in Europe, and once again US Gold talked to them to get the home computer rights. And it's thanks to this that we have Desolator, a quite frankly bloody lousy game on most micro-platforms, but especially awful on the Spectrum. Why so bad? Well, there's the lack of speed and the rather dodgy graphics, but mainly because it's so bloody unresponsive. The game doesn't seem to even register that you've pressed the attack button half of the time, and you can't even attack while moving like you could in the arcade. The broken controls make this version of the game almost unplayable, to be honest. A definite lowlight in this collection, and one that deserves to be an almost complete unknown. Avoid this at all costs. Are we ready for another attempt at bringing a super scaler to the Speccy? Well, here we go, and this time, it's Afterburner. Once again, you may be wondering just how on earth a game like this could possibly be brought over to the Spectrum, and once again you may be pleasantly surprised at how decent the port actually is. Even if Afterburner just by itself isn't necessarily the most complex or engaging of games without any of the fancy things like a big soundtrack or that iconic cabinet or anything like that. It helps that this game is, once again, coded by Keith Burkill, the same fella who put out that impressive port of Space Harrier to the 48K. I'm not quite sure if his attempt at Afterburner is quite as memorable, but it's a very happily playable experience. One little quality of life thing that does help here is that the regular machine gun is always firing, meaning that you just have to use the button to fire your missiles whenever they lock on. On the whole, perfectly okay. It may never be enough to truly emulate the arcade experience of Afterburner, but it's still enough to provide some decent flying action on a little computer. Up next is something that's a bit more pedestrian. Imageworks, a label that belonged to Mirrorsoft, make their one and only appearance in this video, and of all games they've decided to bring Passing Shot over to the Spectrum. I mean, surely you know it. It's a very humdrum indeed System 16 tennis game that's mostly played from a bird's eye view. This Speccy port isn't exactly up to much, but then again neither was the arcade, so I mean, what could I talk about instead? I could mention that the ZX Spectrum did have one of the best tennis sims you could get anywhere at the time, Match Point. Thoroughly basic, merely functional graphics don't mean a whole lot when the game's blisteringly fast and immediately playable, as this one is. Match Point was a whole 4 years earlier than Passing Shot, and the Sega Arcade game wouldn't be able to so much as hold its racket in any version. So yeah, this game's existence is more than a little bit pointless. bit more interesting is another one from Activision, taking care of another rather more obscure Sega arcade. It's SDI's Strategic Defense Initiative. Not necessarily the best of Activision's many Sega ports, but not bad either. This is the game that's kind of like an evolution of Missile Command, where you have both an offensive and a defensive wave, and the rather unique controls do make it a bit of a pesky one when it comes to emulating it on MAME. They're actually done quite well here. You move the ship around normally, and you move the crosshair and fire when you hold the button. It's a bit lacking in presentation, seeing as it's monochrome and there's very little sound indeed, but it's not bad at all. That said, yeah, it would be nice to see a bit more colour and a bit more character, especially seeing as this, like a lot of these arcade ports, was a premium title, running at £10 for the cassette, and as much as £15 if you bought it on floppy disk for your Spectrum Plus 3. But then that was the way a lot of Speccy titles were going as we got deeper into the 1 to 8K era, I'm afraid. US Gold are back again, and, well, you never get much of a middle ground with them when it comes to Sega's arcades. It's either an excellent effort or a total duffer, and unfortunately Thunderblade here is very much the latter. This is what a lot of people might well expect to happen when a superscalar arcade gets ported to the ZX Spectrum, a miserable, ultra-slow, virtually unplayable mess. The controls are not translated well at all, meaning you kind of have to flutter around between the keyboard and the joystick if you want to play around with your chopper's speed. This is, needless to say, difficult when everything is shooting at you. You can put all the controls onto the joystick, but this only serves to make the game even more unplayable. On the whole, this is a disaster, and indeed US Gold's take on Thunderblade was a stinker on every platform. The only really interesting thing about it is the very sneaky Pepsi sponsorship that US Gold stuck into the 16-bit versions of the game. Dreadful. Another one-and-done affair, Alien Syndrome comes to the 8-bit micros courtesy of Ace Entertainment. You may wonder who these guys are, and the answer is that they're a pretty short-lived label that belonged to Edge Games. Yes, that Edge Games. Tim Landell and so on. Alien Syndrome is one of my absolute favourite Sega arcade games of them all, so you can bet that I'm a stickler for the details on this one. But I really don't need to be, as this is pretty clearly an absolute shocker from the get-go. The controls are simply balked, and I honestly have no idea why. It's not like the original game has much else to do beyond moving around and firing. So how do you make it so bad that it's damn near impossible to hit anything at all? Why does the player constantly have to turn everywhere? This is just a poor effort really, to the point where I genuinely wonder if the people who made this port even played the game. I find myself extra disappointed by this, not just because of how much I love Alien Syndrome, but because this is a game where a damn good 8-bit micro version would absolutely have been doable. Sadly, this is not it, in any way, shape or form. Again, we have another software house that only put out one Sega Arcade port. This time it's the turn of the almighty Firebird. And thankfully their port of Action Fighter results in something very decent. The original arcade is perfectly fine, being a rather generic System 16 take on the venerable Spy Hunter, but just as that game was very good on the Speccy, it turns out that this one is too. One nice little touch here is that the little direction at the top never disappears. I find this helpful, as you always have a pretty solid idea of where you need to go, rather than constantly crashing as the road twists about. All the features are here, and the game is very nice and responsive. An excellent effort indeed. Top marks again. Now you might get a bit of a clue as to why this port is so good when you see who developed it. This is actually one of the very first games made by UK development legends Core Design. who'd go on to be one of the very top studios around in the 16 and 32-bit eras. They got off to a pretty nice start here, has to be said. Here's another good one, and it's another one from Activision. Time Scanner from 1989. Again, it's not a very famous Sega arcade. This one's basically just video pinball. But what might feel a little unnecessary in an actual arcade where there's plenty of real pinball machines usually kicking around, is actually an awful lot better in the home. In fact, this port of Time Scanner might just be the best pinball game on the spectrum. Damning with faint praise? Well, not at all. It's very colourful, it's got all the features, and it's just generally a lot of fun. While you may struggle a bit to find a truly accurate pinball game on an 8-bit computer, at least until that port of Pinball Dreams for the CPC came around a couple of years back, this is a very capable effort indeed. A couple of years ago, US Gold went out there and disgraced the name of OutRun with a miserable, infamously bad port for the Speccy and other computers. And now they're back, this time to have a go at Turbo OutRun. Oh no. But as it goes, this one isn't bad at all. While the quality of US Gold's various Turbo OutRun ports can be inconsistent to say the least, it seems like the big software house were fixing to make amends on the Speccy. This is actually a very decent port of the arcade. We've got much bigger sprites that look pretty good. The courses move properly and the tracks don't feel completely empty. And hey, there's still some decent music here. While I don't think Turbo OutRun as a whole is anywhere close to the original, this is a perfectly good port of it. I mean, it's a whole load better than the bloody Mega Drive version. It's worth noting that this port was actually done by the same people who did the original OutRun for the Speccy, which kind of adds further to the whole Redemption Run narrative. It's also worth noting that US Gold loved making OutRun games so much that they ultimately put their own footprint on the series, resulting in OutRun Europa, a rather odd game that doesn't have much in common with the original game at all, being more of an action title. Interestingly, OutRun Europa was actually first previewed in mags in 1988, but was then delayed for a long time after US Gold got the rights to port Turbo OutRun. It finally resurfaced in the summer of 1991. It's a pretty okay game on C64 and Amiga, as it goes, but on the Spectrum, well, here's the thing. When it was previewed and reviewed on the Speccy, the screenshots showed a game that was full of colour. But then you got the game itself, and guess what? It's completely monochrome. That'll be 12 quid, please. Needless to say, this did not impress Speccy users all that much. Who'd have thought OutRun would be so controversial on the system, eh? Finally, we have a beat-em-up of sorts. Dynamite Dux has always been something of a weird game, and much the same is true of this somewhat obscure Speccy version, only this one's in monochrome. Happily, it's still very much recognisable as Dynamite Dux, cartoony sprites and all, and it's an okay beat-em-up, considering some of the other crimes that were inflicted on the genre here on the Speccy. I am sad to report, mind you, that there is no code here for an incredibly smutty version of the introduction like there is on the Amiga and Atari ST. Anyway, it's hardly Target Renegade, of course, but it's certainly not bloody Double Dragon. Far from the most interesting game here, but it's certainly the most recent game I've covered. At least until I start looking at the next Sega Arcade port. This one isn't particularly interesting either, although the arrival of Scramble Spirits does also introduce Grandslam Entertainment, a rather average software house from these days, into the fray. Much like the arcade game itself, Scramble Spirits is a very run-of-the-mill top-down shooter. Hardly a game that you would regret playing, but it's not something you're going to remember for too long. There is a bit of annoyance with this one. We have the monochrome graphics that are becoming the norm, but they are rather busy, and it can be quite tricky to actually see the enemy's shots, which is a bit of a pain. Let's be honest, as far as top-down shooters on the Speccy go, Graft Gold's port of Flying Shark was probably the benchmark for most of the computer's existence, and games like this one were thoroughly in the also-ran department. It's never normally a good sign when there exists a homebrew version of a game that purports to fix the various problems of the original now, is it? Super Wonder Boy from 1989, or rather Wonder Boy in Monsterland, is an abject stinker from Activision, certainly the worst of their many ports. This one is critically botched in various ways. Somehow they've managed to get the controls completely wrong and given our heroic child Mario-esque momentum like he's always on ice, which is a completely ridiculous pain in a game like Wonder Boy that involves getting up close and personal with enemies and your sword. And as an added bonus, if you bear with the game's many issues and get all the way to the final boss, you'll find out that you can't actually kill him because he doesn't bloody move anywhere. Yes, this game cannot be completed. What a shame. Again, this is a game that probably could have had a pretty decent 128K Speccy version, but this most definitely is not it. Now, here's a Sega Arcade port that I'm very familiar with. Shinobi is one of my favourite Sega Arcades after all. This Speccy version here was one that I played a great deal, well before any other home version, and I'm happy to report that Virgin's effort here is perfectly okay for the system. To be honest, it plays better than more graphically impressive ports on the Amiga and the like, and certainly better than the Commodore's efforts. This port, funnily enough, was by the same people who made the really quite dreadful Double Dragon port for the Speccy. I'm happy to report that this one is a lot better, having the sort of responsiveness you would hope to find in a version of the game. Not an all-time great on the computer or anything, but it works. Right, here's an interesting one. Altered Beast got a port to the Spectrum, and once again, it's thanks to Activision. The first thing to notice is that the Speccy actually does a pretty okay job of replicating the arcade's introduction, with the big moving eyes and everything. And then, when you get into the game, well, there's certainly quite a change from the various mostly monochromatic games that we've been looking at lately. Suddenly there's big sprites and colour absolutely everywhere, and even some rockin' AY music to go with it. It's certainly a looker, and I can imagine that one look at the screenshots would utterly wow people, amazed at what the Speccy was actually capable of. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a price to pay. The movement is, as you might expect, as slow as a tortoise that's had its legs removed. It's so slow that it's just about unplayable. And another thing that doesn't help is that our poor Centurion has no invincibility frames. This combined with his generally weak attacks means he's liable to lose damn near a whole life whenever he gets into a scrap with an enemy. It looks great, but in the end, it's not good. I should at least note that this port was done by the star coder Jason Austin, responsible for some of the Speccy's most graphically exceptional games. Rex, Nemesis the Warlock, and Tarzan, amongst others. Some of those games are pretty good on the gameplay front too, but alas, this one is not. With this game, and the next one, you might well think that Activision are starting to take the piss a little. I mean, surely to God there is no way that Power Drift, an absolutely ridiculous superscalar game, is going to have any hope in hell of a decent Spectrum port. This is right at the technical apex of the classic superscalars, complete with beautiful, fast tracks, lots of cars to race against, and a whole load of hills and valleys. Surely this is impossible, right? Folks, I humbly welcome you to what is, by far, the best port in the entire video, and one of the best arcade ports that the humble ZX Spectrum ever saw. Power Drift on the ZX Spectrum is absolutely superb. I mean, just look at it. Ignore the system's technical limitations, and it damn near gets everything right. The tracks, racers, and the altitudes are all very much here, along with a choice between some cool music, which admittedly does vary in speed somewhat, or some actually not too bad sound effects and engine noise, which usually on the Speccy is really bloody annoying. Unlike the last game, the high quality of the graphics doesn't mean that the game isn't playable. It very much is, just as accurate and as speedy as the system's best driving games like Chase HQ or WEC Le Mans, the latter of which uses the same engine as this one does. I find it hard to pick any holes in this port really. It's absolutely outstanding for the ZX Spectrum, really is. If you thought Power Drift was going over the top, well, how about this? Fricking Galaxy Force. Just, come on now. Sega's superscalar space shooter didn't get anything even approaching an arcade-accurate port until the PS2 generation or even later, and now it's here for people to play on a ZX Spectrum. Surely this is a complete piss take. And again, it isn't. This is the third game in the video by Keith Burkill, the same fella who did Space Harrier and Afterburner, and once again, he's managed to pull out all the stops. Now obviously it's not worth lying. To say the least, Galaxy Force on the Spectrum is over-ambitious. It's not going to get anywhere close to the arcade. However, it is playable. It does feature all the levels, all the tunnels, the left and the right turns, spirited goes at the larger enemies, and it actually does run at an okay speed. Yes, the title music isn't great, but you do get some decent tunes on the 128K version. And that's the other thing here that I need to note. This is actually running on an emulated at least, 48K ZX Spectrum. The dead simple regular model, the one with the rubber keys, the one that had been around since 1982. To me, that's pretty wild. By this stage the 48K Spectrum was 8 years old. The first time in this video that we saw a game trying to emulate a scalar type arcade was Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom, which was of course 48K. Compare that one to this one, running on the exact same hardware, and we've clearly come quite a long way. I definitely think this version of Galaxy Force deserves a bit of credit. With such underpowered hardware, the absolute best effort has been put in to make a version of the game that's as playable as possible, and the end result isn't bad at all. I mean, let's be honest, there's more of an effort to actually bring the arcade's graphics home on here than there is on the bloody lazy and dreadful 16-bit Mega Drive version. While the best Speccy coders may not have had much power to play with, they didn't lack creativity and ambition. Jolly good show, Keith. Activision's last two Sega Arcade ports aren't quite as ambitious, and are indeed pretty humdrum to the point where there's not an awful lot to say about either of them. You've got Hot Rod, a port of the top-down racer that 4 players could crowd around on and play on a lovely cocktail cabinet. Here it's kind of just a normalish top-down racer, one where the flick screen scrolling certainly doesn't work very well at all. And then there's Sonic Boom, which is, pretty far away from being the most famous Sega arcade, putting it mildly. This is a very generic vertical shooter, to the point where you would probably have a great deal of trouble telling it apart from, say, Scramble Spirits, especially in the case of the two games' respective Speccy versions. Both of these games are a couple of years old by the time they arrive on the Spectrum, and neither set the computer on fire, bringing a slightly flat end to Activision's run of Sega ports. Why did it end so suddenly? Well, 1990 is the time when the Mediagenic-owned Activision were facing complete financial ruin. The end of what was already a famous and storied video game brand wasn't just in sight, it was imminent. Until, of course, this fella here stepped in and bought them, proceeding to wipe the slate clean and change the company completely, reversing Activision's course forever. Now, I can't imagine that Bobby Kotick was particularly interested in continuing to create games for the Speccy, and so Activision's participation on the platform came to an abrupt end. As for Sega Arcade ports, well, US Gold is going to pick up Activision's slack. We've still got 11 Sega ports to go through, and most of them are from the Birmingham boys. The quality of them it's going to be a bit variable, to say the least. Before that, we have something a bit different from Grandslam. With Space Harrier being such a hit on the Speccy and other micros a few years back, they decided to bring Space Harrier 2 over. This game here's quite a rare thing then, a port from the Sega Mega Drive to the ZX Spectrum. We have one other example of this to come and, well, let's just say that this version of Space Harrier 2 here is quite a lot better. Unlike the first one, this version is very much a 1-8K title, and thankfully it's one with a little more colour about it. Because it's 1-8K, the sprites are a lot bigger, and while the speed isn't as fast as the first game's port, it's not actually much slower than the Mega Drive version. And there's some AY music too, a port of the Legend of Harrier theme done by the excellent Matt Furness. Speaking as one of those people who really likes Space Harrier 2, I think Grandslam have done a pretty nice job here, creating a decent and playable version of the game for the Speccy. I can't speak for the other versions of the game, mind you. Another little thing that's worth pointing out is that, much like the Mega Drive game, this port has some surprisingly clear voice samples, much better than the norm.
Get ready?
Not bad, eh? This difference is especially marked on the Spectrum when, well, voice samples like this were the norm. Sorry, Oliver Twins.
Advanced Pinball Simulator.
Anyway, this is another very good port. Keep your eyes on it for a little longer, as in all honesty it's probably the last really good port you're going to see in this video. Crackdown's 1990 port to the Speccy from US Gold isn't exactly a big surprise, what with it being a fairly straightforward top-down shooter and all that. But even if it shouldn't be too hard to screw the game up, this is a bit of a mess. I'm not sure if the folks who made this really got one of the game's main mechanics. It's one of the few games of the time where cover is kind of a thing, and you can actually stick yourself to the wall in order to avoid shots. And yet in this version it almost never seems to actually work. A whole lot of the enemies are missing too. Other than that, it's still the same run-around stages and set bombs inside a smallish screen type of action you'll know already, and it's not the worst port we've seen, but it's so utterly middle of the road. As the Speccy enters its final period, the games here are mostly starting to fall a little bit flat. One thing I will say here though, the title music by Mark Cooksey, which does not play at all in the game, is over 10 minutes long. It incorporates just about all of the game's themes, and it's awesome. So even if the port is a bit naff, you might have wanted to load this just for the title music alone. Still, there's flat, and then there's an absolute catastrophe. A profound embarrassment that's so easily amongst the worst games of this video, an abject and miserable attempt to bring a game over that really shouldn't have been this awful. How do you manage to go about doing this to ESWAT? It's just a simple side-scroller, that's all. It's funny, the moment you hear what the game passes off as a police siren, I mean, you just know how horrible this one's going to be. Our heroic cop is also a pretty good contender for being the ugliest sprite on the entire computer, and that's a position with some stiff competition. I really do wonder just how this port managed to stink so awfully. It feels like it was produced in days. and it probably was. The coda is worthy of note. This version of ESWAT was made by Creative Materials, and specifically it was by the enigmatic and talented Richard Applin. Talented in a certain way, mind you. Richard Applin, I think, could be described as a fixer of sorts, a crack operator, someone who comes in times of crisis and, well, he can get you something in no time at all where nothing existed previously. Just don't ask any questions about how he did it. Usually he'll end up writing a lengthy essay or vitriolic rant, or what amounts to a developer's diary in the program code too, something for hackers to discover later on. I mean, in all seriousness, his hidden messages are legendary. Applin is the sort of person who tends to fight fires, and I kinda guess that's what happened here. It seems like he knew that this was not the best thing he'd ever worked on. One of his other games includes a softography, and he does credit himself for this version of ESWAT with a little note saying, "Shh, don't tell anybody." I think that this one is probably the last of the Sega Arcade ports that really could be considered a big deal. In 1990, Virgin Games ported Golden Axe over to the Speccy, as they did for the various other micros. This does at least feel like it had a bit of time and care put into it. We've actually got a more colourful game here than what we've been seeing lately, and we've got some cool title music, a version of the classic arcade music done by the awesome Jerome Tell. Sadly, what we do end up with here is a bit similar to the case of Altered Beast, although this is a little bit more playable. It's a game that looks pretty damn cool in screenshot form, but playing it can be a pain in the arse, as Golden Axe just doesn't translate all that well to a one-button joystick, with fiddly controls that often seem to make you run at random, and strikes that can barely be relied upon. It was still enough for me to play this port quite a lot back in the day, when I didn't have much better, and I still have a bit of a soft spot for it despite its obvious shortcomings. Creative Materials are back again with another Sega smash for US Gold, although happily they do a much better job with Line of Fire than they did with ESWAT. The arcade shooting gallery type action is just about fine here, although there is no option to actually use a light gun with this game. Probably because Amstrad's rather pathetic attempt at one, the Magnum Light Phaser, died a pretty quick death when it finally arrived in 1987. Instead, you control a game rather normally, guiding a crosshair about with your joystick. Surprisingly enough, it's not the trickiest of games. It's actually a somewhat relaxed and forgiving shooter, unlike the ultra-hard Operation Wolf. That said, much like when comparing the original arcades, I would struggle to say that this was a better port than Ocean's much more iconic version of Taito's game. It's perfectly fine, but the source material isn't exactly the best game out there to begin with. Oh heavens no, not this again. This is the other port from the Mega Drive to the Speccy. World Championship Soccer, probably better known as World Cup Italia 90, coming onto the system thanks to Elite. I've covered this a couple of times before, and I have little else to say other than that this right here is easily the worst game in this video, and it is the most pathetic attempt at a football game that I have ever seen, on any platform. It makes the original look like sensible soccer. This is a game clearly done by people who hated football, I think. The computer is so dim that it's possible to simply walk the ball into the goal. The kickoff is for some reason contested between the two teams. The game's outside and yet there's an invisible wall around the pitch, meaning there's no corners, goal kicks or throw-ins. I mean, this literally gets the basics of the game wrong. It's beyond the pale. Who on earth would create a port of a game that's this lazy, this clearly broken, this unfinished, this contemptible? Ah. Well, okay. That makes sense, I suppose. I presume that this has to have been one of the very last games made by Canvas Software, but seeing as these are the same folks responsible for games like Highlander, Miami Vice and It's a Knockout, and a studio that seemed to be pretty much set on purposefully making terrible games and sending them out thinking that publishing houses wouldn't notice, perhaps it's not much of a surprise that they're responsible for this, one of the worst games I have ever played. Nothing but shame on everybody involved here for making this crap and then selling it for a bastard tenner. Oh, and your Sinclair gave this 80% for some reason, just in case you were again thinking that there was some golden age of video game magazines where all the reviews were accurate or anything. There wasn't. So, we are now in 1991. It's the final days of the system, in all honesty. We've got 5 ports left, and they're all by US Gold. Thankfully none of them are quite as bad as the last game, but there is still precious little to shout about here. Super Monaco GP is the last of the racing games, and while it doesn't look too bad, it's a pretty dull one compared to the likes of Power Drift. This is, I suppose, another case where I've never been a particular fan of the original arcade. To me, this series didn't get particularly hot until the Ayrton Senna branded sequel on the Mega Drive, and so this specky version's just never going to do much for me. One particularly annoying thing here is how easy it is to crash. It only takes one little mistake, and even if you feel like you've only glanced the barriers, it could easily end up being a fatal crash, which immediately ends your game no matter how far you're into it or how many courses you've got through. That's pretty bloody annoying. Almost as annoying as the rather slow and dull qualifying you have to do before each race, which you'll probably do with all the pace of a pensioner driving a Ford Fiesta in order to avoid those aforementioned fatal crashes before you even see another car. No need to worry, it's pretty easy to overtake everyone once you actually get into the race. Yeah, this is just very, very dull in the end, I'm afraid. Shadow Dancer is the final game here that's approaching a decent standard, albeit one that I should say is prejudiced a little by playing it on an emulator. Like most of the micro versions of this game, it's a perfectly decent conversion of Shinobi's sequel. You've still got the time bombs, you've still got the bonus stages, and you've still got Yamato the dog. When you're playing the game, it all moves very nicely indeed, and as you would expect. There is one little caveat that I really should mention. This, like a lot of these other Sega Arcade ports, is a serious multi-loader. Every new level requires another big load into the computer's memory, and it's not like these levels are actually that long. Being that this is a cassette format, I'm not talking about 30 seconds or so of disk loading, I'm talking a couple of minutes at least, maybe even longer. Multi-load games like this were kind of the norm at this stage of the Speccy's life, especially in full price titles like this one, and I do have to say that back in the day, yeah, you would be spending much more time loading the games than you would be spending actually playing them. It's kind of important to note this, as everybody complained about egregious multi-loading back in the day, but if you wanted these games in the home, and you only had a Speccy, well, that's the way it was. Perhaps this isn't as bad an offender as something like US Gold's hilariously awful version of Street Fighter 2 that can take 20 minutes or even longer to load up a single fight, but it's still worth noting even in these days when we have emulators that break all the blocks on a takedown for you to see and can load precisely what's needed in a couple of seconds. You could turn off such modcons for an authentic multi-load experience, of course, but, well, like I said, we hated this back in the day, so why on earth would you do that? The next Sega game to get a frankly terrible treatment at the hands of US Gold is Alien Storm. Sadly for this game, the Golden Ones decided to let one of their favoured developers, Tiertex, have a go at it. Tiertex at the time were mostly in the business of completely ruining Capcom arcades on the micros, and not much has changed here. This is a diabolical port. It doesn't look awful, but the controls are completely unresponsive. You can hammer the fire button all you like, frankly it's up to the game whether that press actually means anything. With attacks that happen completely at random and a pace that's thoroughly glacial, what you have here is a total mess of a beat 'em up that shows just how much care generally went into ports to the ZX Spectrum in 1991. Virtually none whatsoever. It may not necessarily be as stupid as something like Renegade 3, but honestly it's not far off in terms of awfulness. The same applies to this ham-fisted attempt at bringing Bonanza Brothers to the Spectrum. This is another case where I find the general screwy nature of it hard to understand. All you do is move, jump and fire. So what's the problem? Well, the jumping mainly. I'm not even totally sure how you do it because it just seems to happen at random, and in a game that generally requires you to have a good idea of what you're going to do in order to evade or overcome the various guards, yeah, that's a slight fly in the ointment. This one, much like the last one, is bad to a point where it could be considered unplayable, and it really makes you wonder what the point at all was in doing something like this, aside from squeezing out a few more tenors from game-starved Speccy owners. When games like Bonanza Brothers are the order of the day, we are fast approaching midnight. And finally, this is the last of the Sega Arcade ports. Appropriately enough, it is at least one that could be stuck into the severely overambitious category. It's G-LOC, or to give it its full title here, G-LOC R360, the banner title for Sega's latest big arcade innovation, the machine that could spin you around all over the place. I have to say I do admire the chutzpah of sticking R360 into the title of this game on the Speccy, as if the computer could even have the faintest whiff of a chance of recreating such an experience. I mean, the only way that's going to happen is if you get Jean-Paul bloody Sigmason to lift you up and twirl you around while you play the sodding thing. Anyway, this came out as late as 1992. I'm pretty sure that this and the aforementioned Street Fighter 2 were the very last games that US Gold released on any 8-bit micro-platform. So, do we have a good game for the finish? One that flies in the face of being so clearly overambitious? Well, no, of course we don't. The very idea of sticking G-LOC onto a ZX Spectrum is comedy, and this port tells some utterly lousy jokes. We've got a cockpit view, and a few planes flying about, but aside from that the port is as bare as anything. Just compare it to the likes of Galaxy Force, released a couple of years earlier, and you see how little is actually going on here. But regardless of whoever made it, not much else can be expected from a studio like US Gold on the Speccy in 1992. Only the most minimal of resources would have been put into this game, coming out for a computer that, around this point, had just about reached its end. It had been one hell of a run, spanning an entire decade, but it was most definitely time to go. And there you have it, a journey into the Sega Arcade ports on the ZX Spectrum. Again, I do think it's quite a different and unique little way of looking at the story of the computer itself. We began in the computer's boom period, with people getting the very most out of the 48K machine. As the 80s went on and the machine continued into another commercial peak, the stakes raised higher and higher and the style of the games did change a little bit. More detailed graphically and certainly on the Sonic front, even if they could at times feel a bit soulless due to the lack of colour. And then, inevitably, we hit the machine's final decline in the early 1990s, as Amstrad gradually shut up shop on the Speccy and the machine slowly faded away, at least from a commercial standpoint. Arcade ports on systems like this one are always interesting to see how developers got around the technical limitations they had. And even if a fair few of these games failed miserably, there's definitely been some marvels to look at here. And with that, I hope you enjoyed the video, and it's time to say, as ever, bye for now.